Again, and people can join us as they see fit. Welcome. This is the Electoral Commons event on the Middle East. Let me just say that the general framing of this is that most of our undergraduates will be voting in the national election for their first time. And it's a kind of a strange election, but that, whether or not that was the case, it's still the first time most of our undergraduates are going to have to make a decision about the President of the United States.
You
Can't hear very well. Yeah.
It's on.
Can you know what? I can do better than that. I hope that one works better. So I was saying that this is Electoral Commons discussion on the Middle East. The idea is that for most of our undergraduates, they'll be voting in a national election for the first time. And whereas our role is not to try to influence their vote towards one candidate or another, we did think we could help our students make decisions about the next president by using the knowledge of our faculty members who are scholars in many of the areas that are going to be relevant to the debates between the candidates and to the policy decisions the next president is going to have to make. So we organized for this semester a thematic semester that deals with the issues of the election this year. And one of the things that are part of that thematic semester is this series that we call the Electoral Commons. What we did is we asked some of the faculty members here, who are very knowledgeable political analysts, to identify what they thought ahead of time were going to be some of the key issues in the campaign. And we took every Friday afternoon in the fall, when there wasn't an away football game, and we scheduled a panel for every one of those, and we invited the faculty to volunteer of things that they felt comfortable talking about. And so earlier this fall, we had one on immigration. The next one was on the international trade deals. The third one was on climate change. And so far, pretty good predictions about what was going to matter to people. This is the fourth, and this time we're focusing on the Middle East. And we're very fortunate that we have three panelists who are as distinguished as they are and as knowledgeable as they are. The basic idea here is behind all the rhetoric that you hear from the parties and the campaigns, what do we know, what do we believe to be true? What do dispassionate scholars have to say about the issues that the candidates are going to try to spin one way or another as a framework and a background to use in making decisions about whose policies you want to vote for. So let me introduce our panel, which is great. First of all, immediately to my left is Laurie A. Brand, who is the Robert Grandford Wright Professor of International Relations and Middle East Studies, and also Director of the Center for Middle East Studies in the USC's Dornsife College. She is a past president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, and she currently chairs its Committee on Academic Freedom. She specializes in Middle East international relations and also inter-Arab politics. She is a four-time Fulbright scholar to the Middle East and to North Africa. She is the author of many books on peoples and states in the Middle East, including the Palestinians, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Algerians. She has carried out field work in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and Kuwait. Pretty impressive, huh? Yeah. Sitting right to her left is Ruvain Firestone, who is the Regenstein Professor of Medieval Judaism and Islam at Hebrew Union College, which is a sister school. Their faculty work with us and teach our courses here. And he's a senior fellow of the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at USC. He is the recipient, like Laurie, of many fellowships, including one from the National Endowment for the Humanities, from Hebrew University, from the University of Pennsylvania, and from the Fulbright Foundation for study at the American University in Cairo, where I know that he and his family lived for at least a year. His writing includes books on jihad and holy war, among many other topics. Professor Firestone founded the Center for Muslim-Jewish Engagement which is a joint program of Hebrew Union College, the Omar Ibn al-Khattab Foundation, and the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at the University of Southern California. Last on the far end, but not least, Mahmoud Sero Galam is a visiting professor at USC this fall from Iran. He is professor of international relations at the School of Economics and Political Science in Shahid Beheshti University, which is formerly the Iran National University. He specializes in international politics of the Middle East, Iranian foreign policy, and political culture. He has written in Persian, Arabic, and English, and is a member of the International Studies Association in the USA, the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, and a non-resident scholar at ASERI, which is in Italy. So we have a very broad representation of very distinguished scholars. Please join me in welcoming them to our panel.
I think it's on.
So, okay, it was on before.
Yeah. Here.
Okay, can you hear me? All right. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming. I just want to let you know how the three of us conferred last week, and we decided to divide up the panel excuse me, the following way. We're each going to speak for about 15 minutes, and so we'll have some time at the end for questions. What I wanted to do is lead off and go over what the two party platforms have to say about Middle East-related issues, because I think that's really important. I think very few people actually sit down and read the party platforms. They're not exactly scintillating reading, but it's important because these are the formal statements that the parties have made. Now, obviously, the actual candidates don't necessarily stick to everything that the parties' platforms say, but I'll try to sort of restrict my comments pretty much to just providing you with the most important content from both of the parties. Then after that, I'll turn the microphone over to Professor Firestone, who is going to speak a bit about how the candidates might think about the role of religion, or how not to think about the role of religion when it comes to policy prescriptions for dealing with the Middle East. And then finally, Professor Sariol Ghalam will talk about what he sees as some of the most important challenges in the region for U.S. Middle East policy. I should also say, just to add to the many things that Richard mentioned in introducing Mahmoud, is that he also has his PhD from USC, so we're really very proud to claim as one of our own. All right, so looking at the two-party platforms, let me, as I said, I'm going to keep my editorial comments sort of to a minimum. I just want to try and summarize what I think are the most important points. We turn to the Republican platform to begin with. The first issue that's raised, and one of the most important ones that we've heard over and over again, I think, in various campaign speeches, has to do with the Iran nuclear agreement. The Republican Party and its candidate, Donald Trump, have made very clear that they view this deal as non-binding on the next president. It has not secured treaty status. Therefore, they do not view a Republican president as bound by it, and Mr. Trump has said that he would, I think, tear it up on the first day. They've been very critical of the lifting of sanctions on Iran, of what they say making money available to the mullahs. They characterize the Iranian government as a defiant and emboldened regime, which, quote, continues to sponsor terrorism across the region, develop a nuclear weapon, and abuse the basic human rights of its citizens. So they view Iran as a country that needs to be dealt with extremely carefully because it continues to threaten, and in their view, American security interests and the survival of America's friends in the region. The next central issue is that of ISIS, which the Republican platform refers to as a form of murderous fanaticism, which has brought butchery into the 21st century. The same paragraph dealing with ISIS talks about hundreds of thousands who have been killed by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad or his regime, and then criticizes the American president for not having been able to rally the world against al-Assad. There is therefore, throughout this document, I think, the theme of restoring credibility to American foreign policy, both in this region and elsewhere. They argue that the United States needs to stand up for its friends, challenge its foes, and destroy ISIS, as well as Hezbollah, which is a political party and militia group in Lebanon. The Republican Party supports a transition to a post-Assad regime that would be a government that would be, as they say, representative of all minorities and religions, and that would support the territorial sovereignty of its neighbors. Presumably that refers to Lebanon, but it's not specified. There's also some mention of Iraq, and it calls for the United States partnering with the Iraqi people, although it does not specifically mention the Iraqi government. So we're to partner with the Iraqi people as long as ISIS and its ilk survive in the region. The Republican platform expresses particular concern, and this one finds in various parts of the platform, with Christian communities, here in particular the Christian community in Erbil, which it says, whose survival is being supported, it says, only by private charities, sort of suggesting that perhaps there should be US government support for these communities. So that for the Republicans, fighting ISIS means not just fighting the group itself, but also supporting the long-term survival of the various communities, indigenous, religious, and other ethnic communities that have been threatened by or attacked by, threatened with genocide by ISIS. They also call for continuing to support the Kurds and for the creation of a safe haven in northern Iraq to protect these minorities facing genocide at the hands of ISIS. I'm not quite sure what they mean there. There is the Kurdish regional government, which exists in northern Iraq, so I don't know whether this is confused with Syria or whether they are talking about an additional region that would be somewhat south of the Kurdish region. Okay, so that's point number 2, dealing with ISIS, kind of Syria and Iraq. Point number 3 is unequivocal support for Israel. There's a long section on that in the platform. This is a standard party plank, I think, for the Republicans and also to the Democrats as well. But the Republican plank calls for recognizing Jerusalem as what it calls the eternal and indivisible capital of the Jewish people. It also calls for moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. It rejects the notion that Israel is an occupying state. And it specifically calls the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS, it calls that anti-Semitic in nature, and so it calls for legislation to thwart any actions that are intended to limit commercial relations with Israel by U.S. Individuals or U.S. companies. It does say that the United States should play a role in establishing a comprehensive peace in the Middle East, but it says that that should be negotiated by the people in the region, and that any measure that's intended to impose an agreement or dictate borders is to be rejected. Interestingly, there's no mention of the Palestinians, no mention for the first time of a two-state solution. So this is a departure in the Republican platform from previous ones. Just a couple more words on the Republican platform, then I'll turn to the Democratic one. The Republican platform singles out Egypt, and particularly Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, as someone who has, quote, bravely protected the rights of Coptic Christians. You may be aware that Donald Trump met with Sisi on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting recently in New York. Trump told him that if he is elected, that he would invite Sisi to Washington, D.C., and that he himself would travel to Egypt if elected. I find this a little bit ironic because there was just recently passed in Egypt a law which on the building of religious structures on churches, which was not particularly generous toward the Coptic Christians. And of course, Egypt currently has one of the worst human rights records in the region. In any case, there is also a call for, or a restatement that radical Islamic terrorism poses an existential threat to personal freedom and peace around the world as well as at home. There is general support for human rights in this document, but nothing about the regimes allied with the United States who are major human rights violators. As for the Democrats, there are aspects related to the Middle East in different parts of the party platform. Under the section on global threats, prominently featured is the need to defeat ISIS, and again, this was obviously central in the Republican platform as well. The Democrats call for defeating ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all of their affiliates. And that a democratic administration would lead a broad coalition aimed at destroying ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, that this democratic administration would continue to garner support from a wide range of allies, including those in the Gulf, to try and accomplish this goal. There's also a promise to dismantle what's called a global network of terror that supports and inspires radicals. Part of this, or central part of the democratic platform aimed at doing this, proposes to significantly improve American intelligence capabilities in the region. There's also a call for a new authorization of the use of military force. You may remember that the last one came in the wake of September 11th, and that called for use of U.S. armed forces against those responsible for the 9/11 attacks. That has been continually used, or since then been used as the basis for further U.S. military engagement in the region, and a number of voices have called for the need to issue a new authorization, which is more specific, and that's part of what the Democratic platform is calling for, one that will be more precise about efforts to defeat ISIS, but which doesn't involve large numbers of U.S. ground troops. The Democrats reject the vilification of Muslims, which has been a part of Mr. Trump's discourse. They also reject the idea that the United States should engage in any sorts of war crimes. By that they mean waterboarding and other sorts of related practices. As for Syria, again, rooting out ISIS is emphasized, leading the international community to provide greater humanitarian assistance to civilian victims of war in Syria, especially those who are displaced refugees. With regard to Iran, the Democrats, of course, take a very different position with regard to the nuclear agreement. They're obviously supportive of the nuclear agreement, but at the same time, they maintain fairly harsh language about other aspects of Iran, about Iran's role in the region, which they call detrimental, and they continue to characterize Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism. Among those, things they point to in claiming that is its activities, including its funding for Hamas in the Palestinian territories, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon. On the other hand, they say that they are willing to reach out and embrace opportunities for cultural, academic, and other exchanges with the Iranian people. So there's really a distinction in the approach between the Iranian government and the Iranian people. Nuclear weapons figures into the Democrats' discourse related to the Middle East, and they reiterate their commitment to preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which they contrast then with Donald Trump's support for spreading nuclear weapons in Asia, but also to Saudi Arabia, which is mentioned specifically. They mention their concern for religious minorities, that they're horrified by the ISIS genocide and enslavement of Christians and Yazidis, and they'll do everything they can to protect religious minorities in the region. There's also a section related to refugees, arguing that every country should take its responsibility for absorbing these refugees, taking up this challenge, and stressing that the United States will find ways to help innocent people by engaging in rigorous screening and vetting, but they also then criticized Donald Trump's approach to a complete ban on Muslim refugees. Just a couple more points, also with regard to the region. The platform pushes for more inclusive governance in Iraq and Syria. It calls for greater support and security for Lebanon and Jordan, both of which are singled out as hosting a far greater refugee burden than other countries. They call for maintaining robust security cooperation with the Gulf countries, and standing by the people of the region as they, quote, seek greater economic opportunity and freedom, which to me seems an odd phrase. What about political freedom and human rights? Anyway, with regard to Israel, the Democratic platform also calls for a strong and secure Israel because of shared values. They support Israel's right to defend itself. They oppose, as the Republican platform does, any effort to delegitimize Israel, including the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The Democratic platform, however, does talk about still working toward a two-state solution, one that would guarantee Israel's future and security, but also provide Palestinians with their independence, and Jerusalem is a matter of final status negotiations. Let me just raise a couple final things, and then I will turn the microphone over to Professor Firestone. There's nothing in here about Turkey, and we know that Turkey is a critical ally of the U.S., but relations have been quite strained recently, as Turkey's been calling for the extradition from the United States of a cleric that they claim, Fethullah Gülen, who is charged by the Turkish government with being responsible for planning the failed coup attempt in July. Relations with Saudi Arabia aren't mentioned specifically, but clearly relations there have also been strained, in particular since the passage last week, the president's veto and then the override of his veto of JASTA, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. This is going to continue to be an issue going forward, I think. Yemen is not mentioned at all, and yet the United States has been supporting a coalition which is led by Saudi Arabia, which has clearly been involved in humanitarian crimes, war crimes against Yemenis, including but not limited to the bombing of hospitals and other sort of healthcare and educational facilities. And then my final point, which ties in with the session you had last week on climate change. The Middle East stands to suffer tremendously from climate change, and certainly the Republican platform in large part denies climate change. The Democrats do address it. I think, we talk about Syria and Iraq as being central to the concerns, the security concerns that we have in the region. One can trace, to a certain extent, the origins of part of the problem that led to the uprising in Syria to climate change, to a sustained drought in the country, which led to rural-urban migration. In addition, there are several countries in the region that are likely to suffer from rising sea levels. Egypt, Qatar, and Bahrain are among them. So climate change is something that American security experts actually point to, national security experts point to, as one of the most pressing, if not the most pressing security issue for the United States today. And it's something that I think we need to think about in conjunction, not just with our own shores and with hurricanes and so on here, but also with regard to our relations with the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I want to, my field is religion, not political science, and not political science in the Middle East. My field is religion, particularly emerging Islam, its relationship with Jews and Judaism, Christians and Christianity, and pre-Islamic indigenous religions in the Middle East. And so I think I'm going to kind of soften you up for the big hitters here who really know more about what's going on in the Middle East. I do want to mention that a colleague of mine, Professor Ibrahim Karawan, was at the University of Utah, mentioned that when he teaches his introductory course to the Middle East, he inevitably gets a couple of students who come up and say, oh, I'm so glad you're teaching this course. I'm taking your course because I need someone to kind of simplify how things are, what's going on in the Middle East. And he says, well, if you want to know anything about what's going on in this region of the world, I have to complexify things for you. We have to stop thinking in simplistic terms. So I want to share with you, I think that you'll understand my point about this. I'm going to share with you a non-classified State Department briefing that is already out of date, so it's not a big issue, but I think it will clarify matters about military issues, political issues, refugee issues, and religious issues associated with what's going on right now. Are you ready? President Assad, who is bad, is a nasty guy who got so nasty his people rebelled, and the rebels, who are good, started winning. Then some of the rebels turned nasty and are now called Islamic State, who are definitely bad. And some continued to support democracy, who are still good. So the Americans, who are good, started bombing Islamic State, who's bad, and giving arms to the Syrian rebels, who are good, so they could fight Assad, who's still bad, which was good. By the way, there's a breakaway state in the north run by the Kurds who want to fight ISIS, which is a good thing, but the Turkish authorities think that they're bad. So we have to say they're bad, while secretly we think they're good. And we give them guns to fight ISIS, which is good, but that's another matter. So getting back to Syria. So President Putin, who is bad because he invaded Crimea and the Ukraine and killed lots of folks, including that nice Russian man in London with polonium-poisoned sushi, has decided to back Assad, who is still bad, by attacking ISIS, who is also bad, which is sort of a good thing. But Putin, who's still bad, thinks that the Syrian rebels, who are good, are also bad, and so he bombs them too, much to the annoyance of the Americans, who are good, who are busy backing and arming the rebels, who are also good. Now Iran, who used to be bad, but now they have agreed not to build any nuclear weapons and bomb Israel, so now they're good, are going to provide good ground troops to support Assad, who is bad, as are the Russians, who are bad, who now have ground troops and aircraft in Syria. I think you're following me? Let me just move on a little bit, because so a coalition of Assad, bad, Putin, extra bad, and Iranians, good, but in a bad sort of way, are going to attack ISIS, who are bad, which is a good thing, but now the Syrian rebels, who are good, which is bad, is getting confusing. The British, who are obviously good, and the Americans, also good, cannot attack Assad, still bad for fear of upsetting Putin, and Iran, good, bad, and now they have to accept that Assad might not be that bad after all compared to ISIS, who are super bad. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip now to a little bit more on religion, because that's my area. To Sunni Muslims, an attack by Shia Muslims, Assad and Iran, backed by Russians, will be seen as something of a holy war, and the ranks of ISIS will now be seen by the Sunnis as the only jihadis fighting in the holy war, and hence many Muslims will now see ISIS as good. Sunni Muslims will also see the lack of action by Britain and America in support of their Sunni rebel brothers as something of a betrayal, which might have a point there, and hence will be seen as bad. So now we have America, which is now turned bad, and Britain, also pretty bad, providing limited support to Sunni rebels, bad, many of whom are looking to ISIS for support against Assad, who now sometimes is good, who along with Iran, also good now, and Putin, who's also unbelievably good, are attempting to retake the country Assad used to run before it all started. I hope this clears everything up for you. The point is the complexity and the fact that political platforms cannot possibly deal with this kind of complexity. This is not to suggest, of course, this was not a State Department document. This is not to suggest that the State Department doesn't deal in complexity. It deals with a lot of complexity. But that's a different unit than the political platforms for parties that are running for office. And so there is a tendency to oversimplify and create synthetic solutions which really are not solutions at all. Unfortunately, and this is something that I think we all have to keep in mind as we think about voting, the people that have the solutions that are obvious are probably the people who are wrong. The people who are willing to admit that life is extremely complex and multifaceted and multi-layered cannot give kind of satisfactory answers to specific questions, but understand the difficulty of working through the issues. And that, to use the discourse that I was talking about earlier, is good. So, right? So, but not necessarily satisfying. So I want to end with a brief schema of this is very, not deep, it's shallow, but I think it will demonstrate my point about the complexity of the situation with regard to engaging religion in these issues in the Middle East and North Africa. And with that, I'm going to talk about the religious communities there, just for 5 minutes or so, most of whom are Muslim. So let's take a look at Islam and look at how the Muslim community is composed. About 80%, these are rough figures, of the Muslim world are Sunni Muslims. And within Sunni Islam, there are 4 different schools of law, surviving schools of law, which provide what are considered by consensus to be so-called valid interpretations of religious law. There are actually a number of other schools as well. Some of them sort of closed down. These are the major schools today. And they tend to represent particular geographies. They all are in basic agreement about the authority of the Quran, God, law, Sharia, and how that works in tradition. But there's the Hanafi school of law, which is significant in Turkey, Iraq, parts of Egypt, and Indonesia. A different school of law called the Shafi'i in Egypt, Syria, India, and Indonesia. The Maliki, which is mostly in North Africa. And the Hanbali, which is almost entirely and only Saudi Arabia. Within these communities, they're all what would be called orthodox, small o, orthodox Muslim ways of looking at behavior, ritual, and that sort of thing. Among all of those groups, there are what today some people call Salafi Muslims. These are Muslims that are, whenever anybody talks about these, speaks in categories, I start to get itchy. I'm uncomfortable because you can't, all of these boundaries are very fluid, and one person's Salafi could be another person's a different term. But let me move through there because that's a term that's often used. These tend to be pious Muslims, and there are many different groups within Salafi Islam. This is not a school of law particularly, although there are certain schools of law that tend to be more highly represented. They are generally pious, traditional, religiously conservative, and probably the overwhelming majority are non-political, not politically active. Although these kinds of issues are very difficult to measure. Among that very significant group of people is a term we say Wahhabi. So what is Wahhabi? This is a kind of Salafi designation. Also, pious, traditional, religiously conservative, not necessarily non-political. The Wahhabis, who tend not to like to be called Wahhabis, but are happy to be called Salafis usually, tend to be in Saudi Arabia or influenced by a 18th century activist, a kind of revivalist named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and that's where the name Wahhabi comes from. Among the Salafi Muslims are what we might call Islamists, you've heard this term, or people who represent political Islam, that is pious people who have traditional practice but are modern in the sense that they want a nation state, their nation states, to be governed according to Islamic principles. Some people who are Islamists are politically conservative, and some are not so politically conservative. Some are militant in their aspiration to instill Islamic religious law and values in government, while some are not at all militant, but would simply like Islam to inform the values of government. So there's a range within that community too. Sometimes you'll see people being branded as Islamists. They're bad people. And it depends on what you're talking about, and of course you are putting a lot of people in a category that they may not fit in. Many Islamists are not in favor of democracy, but some Islamists are in favor of democracy, so there is no single group that are Islamists. There are then within what I would call the Salafi large group, there are also what we might call jihadis. These are internationalists who are militant in general, not particularly interested in the nation-state system, which is seen as a Western attempt to kind of dominate and dismantle the achievements in the Muslim world. So among the jihadis, there are a couple of different groups. One can say in general terms, there's all kinds of overlap and there's movement between, but some jihadis would want to establish an Islamic caliphate. So we would place the people who are behind ISIS in that category to kind of reestablish the old Muslim empire. There are some jihadis who are engaged because they're angry with Western domination and they want to damage what they believe is a kind of crusader enemy bent on destroying Islam. Now, whether that's true or not is a matter of opinion, but these are some of the motivations and some of the rhetoric that we hear that coming out of people who might describe themselves, and certainly are described by some other people, as jihadi Muslims. What percentage of the Muslim world population these people represent, it's impossible to know. Probably not large in percentage categories, but not insignificant in terms of actual numbers. So that's now let's take another group, the so-called modernized, whatever that might mean. Some people might say it's a bad term, moderate, westernized, Western-influenced Sunni Muslims, where feel that Islam is a religion that should govern one's religious and spiritual life, but they function as westernized people that span the political spectrum from very liberal to very conservative. The same range applies to social and economic issues within this very significant community of people living in the Middle East and also in the West. So-called secular Muslims who identify as Muslims but are not particularly religious or practice the details of the religious life. Now, in addition, now we have Sufi. What are Sufi Muslims? So there are various communities and practices with various levels of Sufiness. Some identify with one or another Sufi saint or leader and are devoted to that person's personal spirituality and personal teachings. And there are dozens of such groups with tens of millions of people, Bektashis, Naqshbandis, Chishtis, Shadlis, and various other real, we might say, movements of Sufi tradition. Some identify toward Sufi interpretation or spiritual practice, but they're not members of Sufi orders. They might be influenced by Sufism or sort of feel that they're part of a kind of universal Sufism. This is just within the Sunni community, and there are many, many other groups as well within that community. I think of what we tend to do in America, because we don't know a lot about Islam, nor do we have many contacts with Muslims. We tend to put people in a single category. Here are Muslims. This is how they think. This is what their religion teaches them. And it's a very big mistake to make that assumption. It's almost like saying all evangelical Christians are the same, or all Catholics are the same, when in fact these communities make up a broad range of social, spiritual, political, and ritual perspectives. And then within the Shia world, there are Jafari Shiites, Twelver Shiites, Zaydi Shiites, Ismaili Shiites in different parts of the world. Some in Iran, Jafaris, and Zaydis in Yemen, and the southern part of Saudi Arabia, Ismailis in part of Afghanistan and parts of India, Shiite breakaways like Alawis that are represented by President Assad in Syria, and Alevis, who are not Alawis, although they come from they have the same name that is pronounced differently in Turkish than in Arabic, and live in Turkey, but they are not the same community of people. And they're Druze, who are probably not Muslims, but some people might say, well, they emerged out of a kind of Shiite movement, and so they have Islamic roots as well, and that's another community. And then there are Ibadi Shiites, and they're also, or they're Ibadis, who are not Shiites, who tend to be in Oman, and there are Ahmadis, which is a new movement that developed in the 19th century of Muslims. So there, in addition to that, then there's the ethnic categories. There are Arab Muslims, culturally different in many ways from Persian Muslims, different in many ways from Turkish Muslims, different in many ways from South Asian Muslims, different in many ways from Indonesian or Malay Muslims. So we have to, I think I made my point. With that, I think I'm going to pass the baton to the others who will now help us understand more of the kind of political issues that we're dealing with. I guess I should say one more thing, and that is that what motivates people to engage in whatever they're doing in the world is aspects of their identity. And so anybody in this room, as well as in the Middle East and everywhere else in the world, has a gender identity, you have an ethnic identity, you have a linguistic identity, you have a spiritual identity that might match up with your religious identity or maybe not. And all of these identity factors, your economic status, your political strength within the community that you identify with, these are all issues that motivate your behavior. So this is something that also needs to be taken very carefully into consideration when one is trying to break down and understand why people are engaging in what they're doing, not only in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for the opportunity to be in this panel, and thank you, Laurie, for the opportunity to come back to USC and to work here. I will address three issues. One, the nuclear agreement between the US and Iran. Second, the Iranian-Saudi competition and rivalry, which happens to be a mainstream discussion about the Middle East. And thirdly, I will address some of the challenges of US foreign policy in the Middle East. Now, on the nuclear issue, as much as I know, and I was involved in, I think there is a broad strategic bipartisan consensus in Washington that this agreement has been beneficial for American security and regional interests. And I think there are four reasons why that is so. The first reason is that this agreement postponed, if not terminated, the question of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. That was a major American concern in the last particularly 20 years as Iran's nuclear program was advancing in many directions. The second reason why this nuclear agreement has been beneficial is because it diminished the fears of American allies in the region. Both Arab countries, and I think to some degree Turkey, and certainly Israel. The third reason is that it terminated a potential war and conflict, a military one, between Iran and the United States. And the fourth one, which I think is very significant, is that the nuclear agreement opened a window of opportunity and engagement between Iran and the United States for potential trade, joint ventures, travel, and also cooperation on many regional issues. I remain very much certain that there will be spillover effects of this agreement on many other disagreements between Iran and the United States. I think the benefits of cooperation as they are witnessed by both Iran and the US will affect future Iranian-American relations. We should also keep in mind that not too long ago, Iran was a strategic ally of the United States. And I think given the fact that Iran went through some 4 decades of change, internal change, I hope that in my lifetime there will be a resumption of normal relations between Iran and the United States. But let me also say that the real asset and resource of Iran for the US is the Iranian society. There will continue to be disagreements between Iran and the US on many political, geopolitical, and global, and perhaps ideological issues. Now, we have a normal relationship between the US and China, but there's so many outstanding conflicts between the two countries. Some of these ancient countries like India, China, Iran, they will continue to have disagreement with the US as a global power. The real asset is the Iranian society, which happens to be very educated, cosmopolitan, very much interested to exposure to the outside world. There are now 11,000 Iranian students studying in the US, which was not the case some 5 years ago. So there is a gradual opening up between the two countries, and I think that the assessments of Obama administration about Iran are rather measured, perceptive, and accurate. The fact that they dissociated the nuclear issue from other disagreements that the US has with Iran. And they focused on the nuclear issue, and after a long 2-year process of negotiation, it ended up in the agreement that we have witnessed in the last year or so. And we are gradually also observing some of the economic benefits that the US has promised, and also Europeans have promised to Iran in the process. I think we need a new generation of leaders in Iran for a potential normalization between the two countries. We should also keep in mind that the leadership in Iran has an age range of 75 to 90, which is reminiscent of what happened in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And that, with a change of generation in Iran, I think there will be lots of openings between not only Iran and the US, but also Iran and the global and the international community. Let me turn into the second issue of Iranian-Saudi rivalry. This pretty much reminds me of the British and the French rivalry and competition in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. I think for the most part, the rivalry between these two very powerful countries in the Middle East, it has to do with power, geopolitics, and influence. I think religion and ethnicity do not play a very significant role in the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We will continue to see this rivalry for many years ahead of us. Even before the Iranian Revolution, there were competition and rivalries between Iran and Saudi Arabia over regional influence and regional power. I think for the most part, these two countries have accepted, through restraining themselves, that there will not be a military confrontation between the two. And they are basically following a policy of having proxies in the region in terms of their regional geopolitical ambitions. In Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in the Palestinian territories, and also in some other Arab countries. As to Iraq, I think Iraq will remain an unstable country for many years to come. Syria will be a failed state. There is an estimate that we need some $300 billion for Syria to return to 2011 social and economic conditions. The current government in Syria only has 20% control of the totality of Syrian landscape, maybe a very small enclave in that country. Some 9 million Syrians have been displaced. 4 million Syrian children have not gone to school in the last 4 years. And some 6 million Syrians now live in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon as refugees. I think that issue will remain with us for many years to come as well. So that is a very tragic issue in the Middle East, the Syria and the Syrian future. Now, let me turn to the question of U.S. challenges in its foreign policy as it relates to the Middle East. I think, given the nature of the conflicts in the region, American policy will be more of conflict management rather than conflict resolution. And many of us may be surprised that next year, with a new president in Washington, we will see more continuity in American policy than change because of the dynamics and the strategic calculus that is very much inherent in the region. I think American strategic relations with Saudi Arabia and many GCC countries will remain. There will be some engagement with Iran. There will be fundamental disagreements with Iran. American-Turkish relations will improve. But the most important challenge, in my perspective, with regard to American policy in the Middle East, it will not be the regional countries. I think it will be Russia. Russia, what we call in literature in the international relations field, is a dissatisfied power. Russia has this grandiose sense of self-importance, but it does not have the resources to be a global power. President Obama pretty much disturbed the Russian political class when he said Russia is a local power, is not an international power anymore. And I think the whole Syrian issue for the Russians is a leverage to play European politics with the United States and global politics with the United States. So I think if the U.S. is in preparation for a more effective policy in Syria, in Iraq, and also with Iran, U.S. needs a well-balanced, a more perceptive, a long-term oriented, and perhaps Europe-coordinated Russia policy in the coming years. That is going to be a major U.S. challenge, I believe, in American larger geopolitical Middle Eastern politics. Thank you.
So we have a little time for questions. And a lot has been said, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. I was prepared, but I see some hands going up already. So I'll just give you a chance to ask your questions. Why don't we start right over there?
I am of Palestinian descent. My parents, maternal grandparents, and paternal grandparents were kicked out of Palestine in 1948. My maternal grandparents were a well-to-do family. Can you hear me? Anyway, my maternal grandparents were a well-to-do family. And literally within overnight, we became refugees in Jordan.
Is that supposed to be for me? I mean,
Probably.
okay. Well, I mean, as you know, you're familiar with what the policy the United States has pursued. There have been some changes over time, depending on administration, but not tremendous changes. At this particular point, I mean, John Kerry and the Obama administration was engaged in trying to make some sort of a push, and this has also not come to fruition. I mean, that in and of itself, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the ongoing conflict, we could have easily had an entire panel devoted to it. And there's a deep history to the relationship between the United States and Israel. This has to do with domestic politics. There now are, I think, there have been significant changes in regional politics whereby it no longer, if it ever did, makes sense to think about sort of Israel and Israel by itself, supported by the United States, but instead there have been some transformations in major regional players such as Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia and Israel now taking very similar positions. I mean, it's not a secret anymore. It's in effect, in some ways, a tacit alliance. It was in part brought about as a result of what was going on with Iran, but I mean, there are deeper roots than that. So there are all kinds of changes ongoing in the region now, which are difficult for regional actors to deal with, as well as for the United States. And it has meant that, given what has been intractability, in part as a result of U.S. involvement, but not exclusively because of U.S. involvement, that this is simply not an issue area where American presidents have drawn tremendous benefit as a result of active, intensive engagement. And so I think we talk about American politics, we talk about electoral cycles, and the fact that the Obama administration remained engaged and continued to try and push for something between the Palestinians and Israelis as long as it did, I think is somewhat surprising, although because Obama's not going to be he's not up for re-election, that probably explains it. But I wouldn't expect there to be any significant move forward until we have a new president in place. You may remember, actually, some of the very early statements that Donald Trump made because we were talking, there's this big, the art of the deal, and he was saying, yeah, he'd like to, that would be a real coup if he could bring peace to Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, obviously there wasn't a great deal of depth to the discussion there, but I mean, I think it is, I mean, to say it's complex is a cliche. But I think we're going to have to wait, again, until there's a new administration in place, and then we'll have to see. I mean, I went through the party platform elements. There's not a major departure from the, for the Democrats, and if anything, the Republicans are not even talking about a two-state solution anymore.
Another question?
I want to thank everyone for coming. I did have a question for Professor Firestone. I was wondering what the religious perspective on the Iran-Saudi conflict would be. Professor Mahmoud puts this in a very geopolitical perspective. I was wondering if there really was a religious perspective, or if that's just what we're told, or that it's true.
Thank you. Yeah, I would suggest that I don't disagree with Professor Saril Ghalam. I think that these are political issues at core. I think the religious bifurcation or the distinction or the division between Sunni and Shia becomes a convenient means of capitalizing on these other issues. So does the ethnic card. So I think that those are not the driving forces, and there are periods of time when different religious communities within the Muslim world get along relatively well together, and there are other times under stress where they become points of divide.
You spoke quite a bit about the United States' relationship with Russia and how that is evolving over the course of this election. I was wondering if anyone could speak about how the different parties would engage with NATO in countering Russia over the course of the next few years.
I would think there will be more of American initiatives with Russia. We will return to the old mix of cooperation and conflict with Russia, I think, in American foreign policy. NATO is basically an umbrella for the whole region. So I think there will be more continuity of using NATO for European protection. But the real issue is how U.S. will view Russian ambitions in the Middle East and perhaps in Eastern Europe. I think there are lots of reviews, as much as I know, in Washington about this issue. My assessment is that there will be some cooperation on non-geopolitical issues like economic issues with Russia that may have some spillover effect on the Middle East and Eastern European question.
Do you want to?
So there's a view that a lot of the issues in the region are a product of Sykes-Picot.
It's
Sorry, can you not hear me?
not very well, no.
Sorry. I know. So there's a view that a lot of the issues in the region are a product of Sykes-Picot, which essentially form nation states, regardless of ethnic boundaries and conflicts. To what extent do you think that nation-state system is actually going to preserve in the region? And is there a possibility that we'll see the emergence of a true Kurdish state for a population that's arguably the most oppressed in the region?
Okay, just obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, there's been a lot of discussion about Sykes-Picot. The end of Sykes-Picot, there was a whole sort of series of editorials and opinion pieces and commentary on that. And I mean, one of the basic points to make is that the borders that were drawn don't replicate Sykes-Picot. The borders look, quite different from what Sykes-Picot, produced. But the larger point is, are the borders that were put in place as a result of what happened at the end of the First World War and the division of the Ottoman, those Ottoman territories, are they going to survive? I think that, the end of those borders has been, the death of them, the imminent death has been greatly exaggerated. It's not to say that I don't think it's possible, going forward, that there could be some modifications, but the state system in general has largely throughout the world been fairly resistant to major border changes. Again, there are some exceptions, but I think that with the constant pounding of ISIS that's taking place at the hands of this coalition, that ultimately the border between Syria and Iraq will be reestablished. What's more in question, I think, now is what's going to happen along the Turkish-Syrian border. And that's very much in flux, and that's in part as a result not only of the civil war in Syria, but also of the current Turkish government's ongoing assaults in the southeast. And I would just say that we had a colleague here last week who was talking about this. We don't get a lot of news from southeast Turkey here. We don't get a lot of pictures. But the destruction, the landscapes, if you will, the cityscapes in southern Turkey, if you didn't see the signs, would be indistinguishable from the cityscapes in massively destroyed cities in Syria. That's what the Turkish government is doing in the southeast. So how that is going to emerge, resolve itself, I don't know. But I think it's a bit too early, and I'm not saying whether people were optimistic by saying this, whether they're being pessimistic or just saying, the world's all changing. But I think those borders are less flexible than one might think. And Mahmoud, did you want to jump in?
Just a few words. The two main players on the Kurdish issue, Turkey and Iran, are not interested in partitioning of the region. Saudi Arabia and Israel have different calculations and ambitions. I think the crucial issue for the future of the Kurdish matter is American policy, how the U.S. will position itself in the region. That's one. The other thing about Sykes-Picot, I think the real issue today in the Middle East is the question of accountability, transparency, good governance, and trying to provide for the average person in this region. I think the border issue is no longer, at least for the good majority of Middle Eastern countries, is not a major issue anymore. I think the good governance issue really stands out as the penetrating and the significant issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys added in the price of oil, your thoughts about what's happening in the Middle East. Is the low price of oil part of an outcome between the fight between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is agreement OPEC to cut back production instead of Dayton, or is it totally irrelevant to what we see the disputes between Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, what's going on?
That's for, no, that's for you. No, you did. No, you did.
I tend to dissociate the oil dynamics from geopolitical issues. I think that has a lot to do with the global economy and Saudi economic relations with the U.S. and the European Union, and their assessments of the future of the global economy. So there may be short-term rivalries on the price of oil, supply and demand between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but I think Iran is not a major player anymore in the oil question. Saudi Arabia is far more significant, and I think that's a different issue from other rivalries in the region.
Just add one quick thing. Yeah, just add one quick thing, and that is simply that for the countries that have been so heavily dependent on oil and have allowed themselves to develop distributive policies by which their citizens are rewarded in various ways with all kinds of social benefits and so on as a result of the oil largesse, the reduction in the price of oil has resulted in significant belt tightening. I mean, we saw one round of that actually before the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring. It was part of what triggered some of the. It was part of the economic explanation for the outbreak of the uprisings. But this is a long-term thing. The Saudis now are dealing with looking at serious budget deficits. The Algerians are actually for the first time talking seriously about having to restructure the bases of their economy. This intersects with the question of good governance and with questions of corruption, which have plagued the region for years. So I think I think oil is important, but I see it as important in terms of the domestic politics and what that has to do for governance and stability internally going forward.
Do you expect any radical change in U.S. foreign policy after the U.S. presidential election in Syria?
With regard to Syria? I think in short, no. I mean, I think that both, if we look at the party platforms, both parties are committed to defeating ISIS. They are, ISIS has been identified as a primary, if not the primary, foreign policy. Defeating it has been identified as the primary foreign policy target, really in both of these platforms, if in somewhat different ways. The fact that a good portion of the foreign policy establishment has endorsed Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, as you may know, was well known to have advocated for a much more aggressive U.S. policy in terms of military involvement, bombing, and so on. And it has been President Obama, apparently, and perhaps others in the administration who were, not eager to go along with that, fearing that this would lead to, I think, more a commitment of American troops in Syria. So, there's an interesting piece by Stephen Walt that was in Foreign Policy a number of weeks ago, asking this question about, how different might foreign policy be after the elections. And I think what he pointed to, a number of structural elements which would serve to constrain any major departures from existing policy, not the least of which is that I think the American public, regardless of which candidate they're likely to vote for, I think has really developed a strong distaste for commitment of large numbers of American troops to foreign engagements. So I think that serves as breakup for both presidents, for both presidential candidates, both prospective candidates, as for any major change, like introducing large numbers of American troops to Syria. I don't see the end of the road in Syria, but I don't see a commitment of a large number of American troops as part of the next step.
Last question.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask one more question about voting. And so, as you've talked about, we talked about the distinctions between the two parties, and kind of started to talk about what U.S. decisions will look like in the future, kind of regardless of which party is elected. We're seeing this sort of continuity in either party, in a certain sense, and we can see that a lot of the policies that the two parties are proposing are quite similar in a variety of ways. Is the position on Israel being an example, but many others. So I'm just wondering, as we're voting, particularly making a choice on the president, is there a way to vote that would be a vote that's making a decision on how we would like things to be carried out in the Middle East? And that wasn't very articulate. But basically the idea that can we vote on anything other than the differences we see in domestic policy? Will these differences in foreign policy, can we make an informed decision on the president that also reflects what we see in the platforms in the foreign policy realm? Do you see what I'm saying?
I'll say a few things.
I think the main difference will be between the two parties on their approach to China. That will be a major distinction. And maybe on NAFTA in North America. But on the Middle East and Europe, I think there will be continuity of American foreign policy. That's my take here.
So I'm just, if I can just, so you're not concerned about the repercussions for the nuclear agreement if if Donald Trump should be elected?
I think it will be honored. I think both presidents will honor the nuclear agreement because I think it is a strategic decision in the United States beyond the parties because the major institutions in the United States, defense, intelligence, Pentagon, I think they have all consented to the positive ramifications of the nuclear agreement. So I think they will both honor.
As we are beginning to wrap this up, I just want to urge you all to make sure that you do vote. And if you are a resident of another state, not California, you can vote with absentee ballots in pretty much everywhere. So just make sure that you are registered and make sure that you do vote in this upcoming election. There are other issues in addition to the presidential race. There are lots of other important issues as well. So be informed and make sure you vote. Please.
So I realize that people came to the room, very complex issue, only to discover it's more complex than we thought it was before. But I hope you've had some enlightening, some points of clarification as a result of this last hour. So please join me in thanking our panelists.